Welcome, everybody. So good to have you with us. Thank you for coming. My name is Jens Hilke. I'm a conservation planner with Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. Dave, would you introduce yourself, please? Oh, there.
Hi, all. Dave Maroney, a conservation planning specialist, Jens's partner in the community wildlife program at Fish and Wildlife, and happy to be here.
Great. So for the next hour, we're going to be talking about gray and green infrastructure and really playing with that infrastructure piece a little bit and seeing, talking about green infrastructure and then gray infrastructure. So some of you are old hat, but just a reminder, please do mute your microphones, excuse me. Please do mute your microphones during the presentation. Keeps down on background noise. We'll be putting information in the chat as we go. But you can practice using the chat right now if you just enter in your name and what town you're from or organization just to introduce yourself to the group. That would be great. Feel free to turn off your video. This presentation is being recorded, but would be great to see your faces at the end for the Q&A. And actually, we'll be doing questions and answers during the presentation. So we'll stop we'll have divided the presentation today into 4 different segments. And so we'll stop after each segment and welcome your questions at that time. So you can write the questions in the chat as we go. Because we're a small group, we can also unmute our microphones and ask the questions directly when that comes up. But Dave will talk us through that piece when it happens. Dave and I are from the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, and we believe in the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. That's a big mission. It takes us in a variety of different directions. And we work for the Community Wildlife Program. So we offer free technical assistance to Vermont municipalities, as well as regional planning commissions, municipalities. And so this includes presentations and workshops, as well as support with mapping and prioritization. And we're happy to help work with your town. So as I mentioned, we're going to divide this up into 4 different categories today. So first, there's this introduction piece, but then I wanted to get into a little bit of context setting. Then we'll talk a little bit about, and in that we'll really talk a lot about the green infrastructure piece. Then I wanted to talk a little bit more about climate change and fragmentation and how that colors our understanding of everything that's going on. And then really move into the section on gray infrastructure, and then we'll really put that all together and we'll talk about things like the Terrestrial Passage Screening Tool in the last segment. So you'll see these next up each time there's a section break, and so you'll know how far along we are in the presentation. So let's just talk first about green infrastructure. And the definition that I got from my colleagues at Department of Environmental Conservation is that green infrastructure is a wide range of multifunctional, natural and semi-natural landscape elements located within, around, and between developed areas at all spatial scales. This includes everything from forests and meadows to wetlands, floodplains, and riparian areas. Now, usually this term green infrastructure is applied at a very local scale, things like rain gardens. And so it's thought of as things that you build that are natural, and so we call it green infrastructure. But I really want to use this term green infrastructure to talk about, at this coarsest scale, and to really think about forests and wetlands and the natural areas across Vermont, and how that is infrastructure that is working for us. That's green infrastructure that's working for us, that's providing services. Then we'll talk about how to mix that with the gray infrastructure movement. So really the best way to think about the green infrastructure at this statewide scale, and all of how the forests and the wetlands and all these different ecosystem types, how they fit together, is to think about the Vermont Conservation Design. And so the Vermont Conservation Design is a science-based vision to sustain the state's valued natural areas, forests, waters, wildlife, and plants for future generations. The Vermont Conservation Design, VCD, is the big picture vision. It's the design that answers, how much is enough? Where do we need these natural areas? Where do we need these functioning ecosystems? How much of a specific natural community type do we need? Where are those distributed across the landscape? So BioFinder is the website, and that's where you can interact with the design and zoom in and zoom out, and really get a sense of how that operates at different ecological scales. Now, VCD envisions an ecologically functional landscape, okay? But that sustains environmental services. So not only does this functional landscape deliver biological diversity and things like that, it also delivers environmental services like clean air and water, carbon sequestration, and flood protection. So the design was originally created with biological diversity and climate resilience in mind. But of course, it envisions this ecologically functional landscape, which in turn provides this huge range of environmental services. And so that's why I maintain that this is at the heart of our green infrastructure. This is the design of green infrastructure across the state. Now, I want to think about that in the context of climate change. And thinking about this as a natural climate solution, and that provides resilience in the face of climate change. And a particular part of resilience, being resilient to a changing climate, is allowing for plants and animals to move around in the face of climate change. So this, these intact, well-connected natural landscapes, they really allow for plants and animals to adapt to this changing climate. And I really think that's one of the best strategies for in continuation of an essential environmental service. So this idea of resilience and a range shift in the face of climate, I think, is an important part of the green infrastructure that we're talking about. So the design in total can be thought of as a singular map, this ecologically functional landscape. We can also explode the design into its component parts. And so one of the, but let me just be clear before I show you the next slide. This isn't an a la carte menu. We do believe that it's the design, all the facets of the design that make this ecologically functional landscape. And it's all of the facets of the design that we need to maintain those ecological services and to serve as green infrastructure. But I do want to pick it apart and show you one component in particular, because as we're thinking about green infrastructure and this idea of species adjusting their ranges in the face of a changing climate, well, these connectivity blocks are one component, one piece of the overall design that are particularly important. Now, these are a selection of forest blocks, so they're not all the forest blocks in Vermont. There's selection that were identified to promote landscape connectivity. So these are the places within Vermont that allow us to connect the Adirondacks to the White Mountains, the Suttons to the Berkshires. But these are a connected chain of forests that also interact with the riparian network to allow for plant and animal movement across the state. So these arrows that I'm showing you are something of the backbone of connectivity, of wildlife movement. We have the largest forest blocks along the spine of the Greens and up into the northeastern highlands. But of course, the true network of habitat connectivity across Vermont is much more complicated than that. There are hundreds, thousands of wildlife road crossings across the state. And so those wildlife road crossings are the most local level. And then these regional connectivity blocks are the state level. And then we can even zoom out and think about the larger connectivity across the entire northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion, this huge area from the Gaspé Peninsula down to the Adirondacks and even in Connecticut. But what you can see from this regional context is just how much of what's going on in Vermont, the connectivity that's going on in Vermont, really allows for connectivity across the whole region. So I often think about Vermont as the crossroads of wildlife connectivity across the entire northern Appalachian Acadian ecoregion. And so many of the blobs the colored blobs that you see on screen are these ecoregionally significant linkage areas, the staying connected linkage areas. And 5 of them are located within Vermont. And so it's just our forests and the connectivity of our forests play this outsized role in terms of connecting the whole region together. So as we think about our forests, there are these ecological values at a variety of different scales, but this ecological value of connectivity and other ecological values of what makes our forests so important. But there are other values. So we can talk about the undeveloped landscapes, and also in terms of rural character, and that special something that Vermonters really value, or scenery, or places for recreation, or places that sequester carbon, or places that improve human health by preventing respiratory illness, or reducing the number of ticks and therefore tick-transmitted disease. So there's this whole range of values in our forests. There are services, ecological services embedded in that. And so as we think about this network of green infrastructure across Vermont, well, there are these huge whole range of values and services that's providing to us. The economic aspect of these services is not to be underestimated. Forest recreation and tourism provide 1.9 billion to Vermont annually. We're going to take a closer look at those numbers. Forest products add another 1.5 billion. That's about 20,000 jobs. Fall foliage tourism accounts for 25% of the tourist income to Vermont. Hunting, fishing, wildlife viewing contribute 685 million. And then, of course, the service of intact wetlands and riparian areas really save the state millions and millions of dollars. So just to zoom into that importance of Vermont's forest-based economy, here are those numbers, a slightly different take on those numbers. But you saw that 1.9 billion, that's down here under forest recreation. And then the sum of that, the top part, is that 1.4 billion that looks at forests, logging and trucking, wood products manufacturing, all of that. So 3.4 billion from this is what the Northeast State Foresters Association estimates for the gross state output of the forest-based manufacturing and recreation economy. Just a slightly different way of showing the same information. Forest products 1.5 billion, tourism 1.5 billion, fish and wildlife somewhere between 684 and 700 million. So again, I'm playing with this idea of green infrastructure. I want to think about it at this statewide scale of across of how this ecologically functional landscape contributes. And I want to think about it in the context of providing services like connected habitat that's really important for climate adaptation, services like a forest-based economy, and then community values of health and well-being. So that's it for this first section on context. Dave, have any questions come up?
Not yet, Jens. Welcome everyone again. We're going to take 3 more breaks just like this one throughout, and these are really your opportunity for engaging in Q&A as we go. And we love for this to be as interactive as possible. And so we encourage you to, whenever a question comes in your mind, feel free to just jot it down in the chat, whether it's a question or a comment or something you'd like to raise at a later point. And this will be an opportunity where I can read those out, keep track of them, and we can make sure that your questions are answered as we go. Now, this webinar, from the last time we did it, we know that we just set the context in this first section, but it will become increasingly technical. So we do know that there will be lots of questions to come, but we want to make space for them wherever they come. So Ask your questions early and often, and we'll be able to get to as many of them as we can. So with that, let's jump into the next section, Jens, and I'll keep tabs on any questions that might come up as we go.
Great. Thanks, Dave. So for this next section, I want to think a little bit more about forest fragmentation and climate adaptation, because this network of green infrastructure is responding to the challenges of the day, and those are really two. So if you look back on our forests, I'll just talk you through this. So at left is really old, 12,000 years ago. At right is really young, 500 years ago. The top series has to do with the distribution of beech and hemlock. And so we think of those two forest types as closely overlapping right now in today's forest. But 12,000 years ago, beech forests and hemlock forests were very separate. And it's only over those last 12,000 years where their range has begun to come together and overlap. Similarly, at the bottom is pine and oak, and those were much more limited and more separated. And now those have the distribution of those has also changed. So the take-home message here is there's been incredible change over the last 12,000 years since the Wisconsin glaciation. Plants and animals have been readjusting their ranges ever since. And so that is nothing new. But the pace at which this has happened has really increased, and the pressure to adjust home range has really increased. One of the drivers here in the recent past is thinking about forest fragmentation. So just in the last 200 years, Vermont's forests have changed a great deal. Now, we went from about 97% forest in the pre-colonial forest, in the 1600s, to about 20% forest in the late 1800s. And we popped up to almost 80% forest and are now pretty consistently in the mid 70s. So this we talked about change over the scale of 12,000 years. Now I'm talking about intense change over the last 200 years. And so as you look at the current map of forest land ownership, you can see that it's a mix of private and public land. About 83% of the land in Vermont is owned by the public, and so this what happens on private land matters a great deal for the future of our plants and animals and these ecological services, this green infrastructure that I've been talking about. Now, the pattern of our forest has changed a lot. And so I would say that well, let me just show you. This is Norwich in 1939. And so you can see, this is in the context of that forest change that I just showed you. This is an agrading forest. It's coming back. There's still a lot of farmland here in the late 30s, beginning to regrow after that height of land clearing in the late 1800s. And then here you can see that there's a historic compact town center at the bottom center of the screen. So then you can also see that there's, here in 62, there's been some light sprawl, linear auto-dependent strip development along the rural highways that's outside of the town center. You can see that there's two distinct forest blocks on either side, and that the road's sort of sprawling in between. You can see there's been some subdivision here in a floodplain that was farmland. You can see that the town center is expanding, but it's a looser settlement. It's much more diffuse than it had been in the 1940s. Shot that I showed you. And then you can see that there's been some infill development of a similar density to the village center. Okay, so here we are in 1994, And so you can see that this the linear sprawl has really continued down these big roads. You can see that this previous road development really literally paved the way for diffuse sprawl into the surrounding forests and farm blocks. This is not clustered development; it's very diffuse. And you can see it here. You know, some of the farmland continues to be converted to subdivision. So then let's look at this in 2024. Here's the aerial photo. Here's that sporadic and patternless division of land that's really eroding the forest blocks. And then here's what I consider to be left of the forest blocks. And so, you know, there's still a lot of trees in this photo, but the actual intact forest is dramatically reduced. And so what's really changed here is the pattern of our forest from the two discrete forest blocks that we saw on either side of the road in the 40s into the 60s to these much more fragmented, much less intact shape that we see here today. So let me just show you this another way. Here's the sort of pattern that we're striving for. Is these large core forest blocks, those are the largest forest blocks. Then these stepping stone forests, the smaller blocks that are so important because of their location. You can't get from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen without utilizing this forest block in the middle. And then these micro connectors like wildlife road crossings and the stream side network. So this pattern of forest fragmentation, even as the number of trees in Vermont has risen since the late 1800s, the pattern of the forests themselves has changed a lot. And really sprawl development is a driving force. It's sort of the de facto development type in Vermont. And is a real driving force in the pattern of our forests and how they're becoming more isolated from one another. Now, of course, the other huge piece of context here is climate change. Already we've seen a 2-degree Fahrenheit increase in summer and a 4-degree increase in winter of our average air temperatures. Spring is arriving 2 weeks earlier, winter is starting 2 weeks later. Annual precipitation has increased by almost 7 inches. And so, you know, climate change is real, it's happening, and the effects are not equally distributed. They're not equally distributed across the landscape, and they're not equally distributed in the context of who's affected. And so that's critically important as we think about our climate future, is this unequal distribution. Overall, the Northeast has seen a 67% increase in precipitation, in very heavy precipitation events. And so again, as we think about this unequal distribution, there are some people that are receiving a lot more of those floodwaters than others. And there's some places that are really dramatically getting hit again and again and again by our flooding and by climate. But, you know, we're also seeing short-term droughts and increasing heat emergencies. So climate change has really put a lot of pressure on our fish, wildlife, plants to move around in the face of this change. So we're seeing changes in the distribution of our forest types by late century, and so you can see here the distribution of the maple beech birch in that orange, and the elm ash cottonwood in that green. You can see the distribution of that under a lower emission scenario and a higher emission scenario moving forward. So certainly our plants are responding to these changes, and we're forecasting significant changes in our plant communities. Wildlife are also on the move. This is a model of some 2,000 animals, mammals, birds, and amphibians, and how they're moving in response to climate change. This is from our colleagues at the Nature Conservancy. we estimate that entire populations are moving on average about 11 miles per decade and about 36 feet upslope. And so they're plants and animals, or these animal species, are moving away from the equator, north and south. They're also moving up into colder area refugia. And so again, the actual network of this movement in Vermont is much more complicated than this. But it is interesting to see at this continental scale how the Northeast is a real funnel for wildlife species. So as we think about our response to climate change, well, let's look at the Vermont Climate Action Plan. And one of the pathways here is to proactively and strategically invest to enhance resilience in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure statewide. So not only is the Climate Action Plan looking at maintaining this green infrastructure as a way of essentially keeping forest as one of our best resilient strategies, it's also saying, well, we need to proactively and strategically invest in a different type of resilience of our infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure. So the Climate Action Plan is a great place to look to understand how, what is Vermont's plan for utilizing green infrastructure and gray infrastructure to respond to a changing climate. So that was a section on climate and forest fragmentation. So first we hit green infrastructure, then we hit climate and fragmentation. Next, we're going to look at gray infrastructure and bring it all together. But before I do that, Dave, have any questions come up?
Not yet. If anyone has any questions, we can definitely take a quick pause to take this time to answer them. So if there's anything on your mind as we've talked about the context for all of thinking about how all of our natural areas can be thought of as green infrastructure, before we pivot to really focusing on gray infrastructure and talking about opportunities there, does anyone have any questions or comments that have kind of been sitting with you? All right, we got one question percolating, perhaps. So we'll just take a few seconds here, wait, see if anything comes through. And if not, we'll be able to circle back. So any questions you have from throughout the entire presentation, we'll be able to answer at any of the later breakpoints. Okay, so yeah, let's move on to the next section. Seems like there might be a question or two kind of coming through the chat, but keep typing that. We'll be able to see those questions and respond to them at the next break. Jens, back to you.
Great, thanks, Dave. All right, so let's jump in. So as we think about gray infrastructure, let me just give you an example. This is US 7 in Shelburne. And so this is bridge, affectionately known as Bridge 144. But look at the top right, there's an aerial photo. And so as you think about this network of green infrastructure, you can see a pattern there. And of course, that pattern is largely around the presence of water and where water is moving, and the conserved land and vegetated land on both sides of the water. And then at the bottom right is the conservation design, the highest priority area. And so you can see that this network of green infrastructure, we're calling a lot of that natural cover highest priority for these ecological services. And so then this bridge stands right in the middle of this green infrastructure. Now, here are Bobcat telemetry points for that same area. So this is where a Bobcat moved. The points were taken every 20 minutes between dusk and dawn for about 6 months. And so each dot is one particular point in time. And so you can see where this Bobcat moved, spent a lot of time in the forests that were along the river, spent time along wetland edges, And then there's this spot, which is actually where the cat moved under Route 7. So in this case, the gray infrastructure isn't just a barrier between this green infrastructure. It actually is part of that network. So the gray infrastructure, this bridge, is facilitating wildlife movement. And I'm just going to go backwards here real quick. And you can really see why. At the left side of the screen, the far left, you can see that in between that, in that section, it's dry ground. And so the cat could move really effortlessly under Route 7 and not get their feet wet. Bobcats, incidentally, hate getting their feet wet. And so it's funny to me to really be able to see how that happens, where how the cat can move and why this is such a great place, such a great linkage between the two. So then let's talk about our infrastructure. And so as you look at all of the bridges and culverts that are out there, we estimate, excuse me, we estimate that there's something like 400,000 culverts in Vermont. Now that's anywhere from these 18-inch culverts that are dry most of the year except for storms, up to in huge multi-span bridges, many hundreds of feet across. So there's this whole universe of gray infrastructure out there. Now we can divide it up into state-owned infrastructure and municipally owned infrastructure. That's a big deal as we think about replacing it and who's going to pay for it. So on the municipal side of things, the principal inventory for municipally owned infrastructure is called vtculverts.org. And I'll show you that in a couple slides, but you can go onto vtculverts.org and get a sense of zoom into a particular town and get a sense of all the bridges and culverts that exist that are municipally owned. Now on the state-owned side of things, there's the small culvert inventory, and that is for culverts that are less than 6 feet wide. Now that word wide is a big deal, and it changes whether we're talking about bridges or culverts. But here, I'm imagining that we are standing in the stream, we're putting out our arms, and the culvert is 6 feet wide, about the width of my arm span. So that's, in this context, is width. Now then there's the Trans Structures database, and those are maintained by the Agency of Transportation. The small culvert inventory, by the way, is also VTrans owned, but that's hard to see. They don't show it on any of the websites. The two that they show are the state shorts, and a short is between 6 feet and 20 feet wide, and the state longs, which are bigger than 20 feet wide. In the state-owned, some of the biggest municipal structures are actually maintained by the state. So the structures that are easiest to find are in that middle bucket, or municipally owned, the bucket on the right. Now, if you want to learn more about these, there are a couple of, the Agency of Natural Resources stream crossing data set. That tells us a lot about aquatic organism passage. And that covers some of the small culvert inventory, some of the VT culverts, and some of the state longs and state shorts, but not all. The Terrestrial Passage Screening Tool that I'll talk about at the end here covers many of the state-owned structures, but not all. So my point here is, as we think about inventory, we don't have a single complete inventory for all the structures that are out there. There's some that cover state, there's some that cover municipal, there's some additional data sets that look at a smattering of each of those three buckets. There's nothing that works for all of them. And so that's really important as you're trying to learn more about the infrastructure that's in your town. You'll go to one place, you'll be able to see one subset. You'll go to another place and see another subset. You can go to the A&R Atlas and see the stream crossings, and you'll know that it takes a smattering from several different subsets. So that's really frustrating for all of us. I sure wish we had a singular database for all of this, but we don't. So then when we talk about state-owned infrastructure, the best place to look is V-Transparency. That is an actual website. You can just write out V-Transparency and Google it. And then I go into these bridge conditions in Vermont. And in particular, I hit the bridge inspection, that map at the far left. And so when I'm looking for state-owned infrastructure, you know, on Route 12, Route 14, Route 16, I-91, Route 2, you know, when I'm looking at state-owned infrastructure on the state or national highway system or the interstate system, I really use V-Transparency. And so you can see, here we are in Cabot, I believe. And so you can see, you can change the background to show these, the aerial photos. And then here we're showing the state shorts in orange and state longs in blue, but they're not there, or they're not on this map. And so you can really get, again, begin to get a sense of this inventory of gray infrastructure and how it overlaps with the green infrastructure. So let's just zoom in on this particular culvert. So if in V-Transparency, if you click on a culvert, it will show you its attributes. So we are on Route 16. The bridge is called bridge number 14. It's a stone arch / concrete box. And then I can hit bridge inspection photos, and I can begin to see actual photos of that structure. And then I can hit the inspection report, and I can actually drill down into seeing some of the actual attributes, the structural attributes. Now, I'm no engineer. I don't begin to understand all of the things that are on here, but I can read the inspection notes and get a sense of if the inspector found that this was really bad or okay, and learn more about its basic attributes. So these inspection reports, they take some doing to get through, but they can be really helpful. And then those photos can tell me a lot. So as I think about this interaction of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure, you know, this culvert is one of the places under Route 16. And I see here in the photo at right, you know, it's wall-to-wall water. Bobcat aren't going to like that. It's pretty short and squat. So, you know, I don't expect bear and moose to be traveling through there. So just by looking at the photos and understanding something about the attributes of the culvert, I'm beginning to get a sense of how it might serve or not as a connection with in this network of green infrastructure. Now, another data set that I mentioned, the ANR stream crossings data set. The red dots that you see on screen, actually they're red and gray and green. Those reflect culverts that have different grades for allowing aquatic organism passage. So a culvert that has a big waterfall at the end of it, the outlet, isn't going to allow for fish species to move up through that structure, and that's going to be called impassable, red. That structure that we just looked at, you know, would be reduced passage. It's narrow. There's some riffles, but you know, generally some fish would be likely to be able to swim through that at certain water levels. And so, but you can similarly drill down into the details. And so I chose a different structure here. And began to get a look at some of its attributes. You know, this network length. You know, how many miles upstream might be barriers until there's the next barrier for aquatic organism passage. And I can get into a whole report on this structure, and again see those pictures and a different set of structure attributes I now know it's 6.3 feet wide, 4 feet high, 70 feet long. And so here's a way, again, of drilling into the details, of learning more about some of the gray infrastructure that's in your town. And then lastly, I did mention the VT Culverts website. And similarly, you can use the map interface to zoom in. For this one, I chose a different structure because the one I just used that showed up in the stream A&R stream crossings and the V-Transparency was state-owned. And so by definition, that's not going to show up in VT Culverts. So I chose a different culvert on Sand Hill Road to zoom in on, and this one's a steel corrugated one. But again, you have this ability to learn more about the infrastructure that's out there, to see pictures, and to begin to get an understanding of how it might facilitate wildlife movement under the road. Now, there are other tools that are out there. There's the Transportation Resilience Planning tool that VTrans created. And this is going to give you a sense of what the Agency of Transportation thinks of as how vulnerable it is to storm damage, and it's and how critically important that is. And that is related to the reducing repeat damage tool. And so here you can get a sense of which of these structures are getting hit in flooding again and again and again. So I'm bringing together a lot of different things here. I'm trying to look at infrastructure in the context of wildlife movement as part of the network of green infrastructure, of allowing for plant and animal movement in response to climate change. So I'm giving you the tools to drill into these various inventories to learn more about these structures. But now we're adding in these ideas of climate resilience and repeat damage. So as we think about the network of bridges and culverts that are spread out across our town, which ones are getting hit repeatedly? Those are the ones most likely to need replacement and appropriate sizing, right? They need to be bigger. If they keep on flooding out, they obviously need to be bigger than they are now. And so those are also potential opportunities for appropriate sizing to allow for wildlife movement. So in this last section, I'm really trying to give you the tools to drill into the gray infrastructure that's out there, to begin to understand how it might be interacting with the green infrastructure that's out there. All right, that was a technical one. I know there was a lot to that, but what's coming up for folks at this stage of the game?
All right, Jens, so we've got a couple questions and comments. For some kind words from Penny and Andrea, just appreciating the whole context setting. So thank you both for that. And some questions about the sort of more technical aspects here. So first is, does the word culvert ever include bridges? Can you kind of explain the Venn diagram of those two terms in relation to these tools?
Yeah, so I used to think those were very different and that it was very clear. And when you were looking at a culvert, you knew it. And when you were looking at a bridge, you knew it. I have learned that that is not as straightforward as it might be. What you see on screen is a culvert. It has a bottom, it has sides, and it has length to it. So it is that is a culvert. It has a structure on four sides. Now, then there are culverts that bottomless culverts. Okay, so when it's really narrow, maybe 12 feet, 14 feet wide, it still looks like a culvert, and it might even be corrugated metal. And so you can say, oh, all right, that's a culvert, but it has the conditions of the stream, the substrate at the bottom are a natural substrate. And so that could be achieved by actually maybe there is a bottom to it. It's just really buried under natural substrate. It could be that it's a half an arch. It would still be considered a culvert. But at some point, we start using the word bridge when those arches get really wide. We start calling that a bridge. And so I can't actually define for you the difference between a bridge and a culvert. When we see a big bridge, we know it. When we see a small culvert, we know it. But please know there's some things in the middle that aren't as clear cut.
Thanks, Jens. All right, we're going to take 2 more questions before we jump into our last section, just to make sure there's plenty of time for it. Ken, I see you've raised your hand. Would you please take yourself off mute and go ahead?
Yes, yes. So we recently had VTrans come and visit our select board and tell us about a number of culverts that were in need of repair in our town. And in almost all the cases, maybe 2 out of the 3 cases, their plan was to make the culvert smaller by putting in an insert and grouting between them. And of course, our select board said nothing about that. And my Conservation Trails Committee wrote a memo into VTrans saying that this is probably not a good idea considering climate change and all of that. And so it's a little frustrating to, VTrans is probably trying to take the most efficient, cost-effective route to solving these failing culverts, better than falling in, I suppose. Is there any coordination going on between ANR and VTrans to sort of, I do know about the project under 89. I showed you the picture of that, I think, at some time we were together. Jens, you mentioned the multi-million-dollar bridge that was going to be going in Waterbury, I think it is. I guess that worked, but in a more general context, like in these small projects, we have.
Thanks, Ken.
So that's my question. Are we
Got
doing anything to make that work better?
Yeah, so there's a great deal of coordination between ANR and the Agency of Transportation. Please know that they are trying to keep that culvert from collapsing. The Agency of Transportation takes in about 60% of the funding it needs to maintain the infrastructure we've got. So they have hydrologic standards to appropriately size everything that they do. And so when they build new, they overwhelmingly build to a hydrologic standard that works for floodwaters, works for wildlife, works for aquatic organism passage. But they don't have enough money to build new everywhere. And so they do line culverts. And it is very frustrating to see that some infrastructure is not getting repaired or not getting replaced, excuse me. But they are making the hard calls with the budget that they're given. Over the last 4 years, we've seen an unprecedented increase in infrastructure money, and that has allowed VTrans to do more work in more places, but there's still just not enough money to replace all of the undersized infrastructure that we have in Vermont.
Ken, thank you for your question. All right, so we're gonna, Diane, I see you've got one question here, but we're gonna hold on that just so we can make sure to get through our last section. And I think we should have time to get it at the very end. But Jens, let's jump into our last section here. Thank you all for your questions, and we'll be back at the end for hopefully another minute or two of Q&A.
Great, thanks. All right. Oh, okay, great. So this, we have developed a tool we're calling the Terrestrial Passage Screening Tool that is really a framework for reducing wildlife roadkill and really addresses the movement through bridges and culverts. So this was coordinated this was a project done by the University of Vermont, PhD candidate named Caitlin Drescher, and in cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Department and the Nature Conservancy. And so it begins by looking at this biggest scale, again, the conservation design type scale of connectivity across the whole area, the whole state. And essentially it models as if it were shooting electricity through the landscape, and assuming that natural cover was a better conduit for this electricity, it shows how places are connected or not connected. And so you say, well, this type of natural cover is good for connectivity. This sort of unnatural cover is bad for connectivity. You shoot the electricity through the model, and it produces a map like this. And so we did that at two different scales. So that statewide scale and a structure scale. And so you have the source strength. That's the occupancy of different species. And in this example, this is the occupancy range for American black bear. You're more likely to see them in parts of Vermont, not in the Champlain Valley. And then you add a resistance score. Those are places in the landscape that are developed where wildlife are, less likely to move or not be able to move at all. And then you come up with these movement probability maps. And again, we did this at that statewide scale and also at the scale right around a particular culvert. So in this series at the bottom, the black dot is the culvert. You can see the source strength for that animal, then the resistance, the particular land cover types, and then at the far right, the movement, the places where that species, in this case black bear, would be most likely to move through that landscape, with the yellow, red colors being better and the bluer colors being worse. And so we did that for 8 different focal species, and then combined all of the different maps together to create a single current density map for all of Vermont. And so then we attached scores to this. And so, Ken, back to your question, this is one of the tools the environmental section is using to flag projects. And so every time they have a road segment where they're going to do work that has a structure in it with a high passability score, I get called in to assess that area for wildlife movement. There are also VTrans also brings in through the 4F process, through the stream alteration process. They bring in DEC and our fisheries biologists to talk about aquatic organism passage. So this terrestrial passage screening tool is one of the tools we're using to give a passability score to these different structures, to put a number on that feeling that I was trying to help you develop in the gray infrastructure section on which of these structures are better for wildlife movement and which are worse. And this screening tool really allows us to get a sense of what species what structures are best for wildlife movement, what are worst, and we can also explode it into its component parts and look at, well, what are structures that have a good landscape score, meaning that wildlife are moving around in that area. They have maybe a good site score, wildlife are moving really near that structure, and have a really bad structure score. The structure itself is deficient, maybe. And that set of structures would be really good for replacement or retrofit. We also could look at structures that are performing well in all 3 categories and have protected lands nearby. So there are various different ways we can use the overall score and the subscores to get a sense of this infrastructure. Now, we have put the terrestrial passage screening tool on the BioFinder website and on screen with the conservation design. So what you see here on screen are the highest priority connectivity blocks that I showed you earlier. Let's just zoom into this particular segment of the connectivity blocks. And then I've turned on the terrestrial passage screening tool. And so those are the overall scores. And let's just pick up on one high ranking score, one score, this particular structure under Route 108. That's 7 feet wide, 7 feet tall, 56 feet long. And so this particular one, you can see in the aerial photo at the bottom right, it got a score of 1,257. So that's lower numbers good out of about 5,000. But you can see there's continuous forest on the right. There's a massive wetland complex on the left. And here's a 7 foot tall pipe going under 108 that connects those two. So that's passable to aquatic organisms, Some terrestrial animals are likely to be able to get through that, but not all. So it's pretty good, but not excellent. So again, I'm just trying to bring this all together and give you a tool, one tool among many, for how to begin to assess how we can bring this network of gray infrastructure and green infrastructure together. All right, Dave, let's go back to those questions.
Awesome. All right, thank you, Jens. So let's jump back to Penny's question from the last round. And that is for all this gray infrastructure, statewide, are there expected replacement dates that are based on some kind of standard lifespan? Do you know about that? Or is replacement really based on,